I'm coming at you live on tape from Sydney, Ohio. My co-host Snickers is out getting ready to celebrate the new year right by doing cocaine, and I'm here to talk about how we went from big bodybuilder type wrestler guys to little guys who are just in shape, like you kind of see at the gym. Now, originally, this is going to be a longer video, by the way. Originally, in the 1800s, with wrestling, you had to be in shape to wrestle. Now, it wasn't as showy. It was more like actual wrestling, like actual amateur wrestling. There was catch as catch can wrestling, which Abraham Lincoln was into, and there was more Greco-Roman wrestling. Those were two popular types of professional wrestling. Abe Lincoln did catch as catch can wrestling, and George Hackenschmidt did more Greco-Roman wrestling. He invented the bench press and was a huge bodybuilder type in the early 1900s, and he was one of the first recognized world champions. Now, in the 1920s, wrestling became more showy. They switched it to a boxing ring, and they had to have people they could sell. Not really like slavery, but people they could, make money off of. So that's when people became more bigger, not bodybuilder type, but more athletic type people. Uh, they still had people like Haystacks Calhoun, Giant Haystacks, and the world's fattest brothers, who I highly recommend looking up because they are they are who the world's fattest twins are based off of on Family Guy. Now, in the 1940s and 50s, with the invention of television, wrestling became one of the cheapest ways to make a television show. It became cheap TV time. And so they were looking for a certain body type. It still wasn't the bodybuilder type. You look at wrestlers, there were fatter wrestlers, but they became much more athletic type people because that's what they were looking for. As I said, they still weren't looking for the bodybuilder type wrestler. They were more looking for athletic people, more like wrestlers today. Now, there were a few bodybuilder type wrestlers, but they were more athletic type people who they could sell as real athletes. Now, of course, this is when wrestling became a mixture of amateur wrestling and the show wrestling of today. We really didn't get into bodybuilder types until the late 70s, early 80s. And that's when a lot of bodybuilders started wrestling because they could make money on the side of bodybuilding doing wrestling. This is when guys like Sting, The Ultimate Warrior, Hulk Hogan joined wrestling because they weren't making enough in bodybuilding, so they joined wrestling to make extra money. Of course, these guys would all go on to become big stars. Though Sting and Warrior, their training was more interesting. Hogan's training was interesting too, but not as interesting as Sting and Warrior's. Sting and Warrior really were trained. Um, when Hulk Hogan became a big star during the Rock and Wrestling era in WWE, that is when bodybuilding wrestlers really took off. because that is what WWE, WWF at the time was showing on the national circuit. They were the only national wrestling organization, and that's what they're showing. And they had a primetime slot on a national network, Saturday night's main event, and that is the wrestlers they were showing, and they were doing national events, and so they were showing bodybuilder wrestlers, and so, but there were a few small wrestlers, notably Macho Man Randy Savage, who was a smaller wrestler and was labeled more of a high flyer type guy. But he was a huge name in wrestling. Now you'll notice we're about at the 6-minute mark now, and I'm not even out of the 80s. So if you're still watching, good job. During the 90s, it kept being bodybuilder types. Now, WWE, WCW was the first to really try, well, really it was ECW. Really started signing smaller people because they needed to fill their roster. And ECW was a group of really misfit wrestlers. They didn't fit in to WWE or WCW, who both wanted bodybuilder type guys. ECW guys weren't as good on the mic, some of them. They weren't as good wrestlers, some of them. They weren't as muscular. They just didn't fit the mold. But they could put on damn good shows. This is where guys like Chris Jericho got his start, Eddie Guerrero got his start, Chris Benoit, Sabu, Rob Van Dam, Taz, Rhino, Sandman. Raven became big in ECW, though he got his start in WWF. He didn't really get any kind of push in WWF. He was more of a manager in WWF. So these are guys that didn't fit the mold. Now, WCW decided after seeing some of these light guys, like Chris Jericho, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Super Crazy, guys like that they were going to make room on their roster for these light guys. And so they created the Cruiserweight division in 96. Now, Cruiserweight was small guys. And the Cruiserweight division highlighted small guys. And with the Cruiserweight division, it immediately took off in popularity. Because it had guys like Rey Mysterio Jr., Chris Jericho, Dean Malenko, Ultimo Dragon, Chavo Guerrero Jr. Did I mention Eddie Guerrero? I might have already. But these are guys who it had, and it just took off. Because these smaller guys could do things the bigger guys couldn't do. Like planchas, like moonsaults, like stuff like that. Meanwhile, in WWE, they finally put their title on a guy who kind of looked like everybody else, only much more handsome. And that was Shawn Michaels. But the problem is, he had a drug problem, and their ratings went down a little bit. But that was because of the NWO birth in WCW. It was not Shawn Michaels' fault. Well, it was his fault. He had a drug problem, but you can argue addiction genes and all this other stuff. So, it really wasn't until But once again, even with the cruiserweight division, the light guys weren't really getting world titles except for Shawn Michaels. It wasn't until WWE bought WCW and Jeff Jarrett was out of a job, and he teamed up with his father Jerry Jarrett and another partner whose name I don't remember, and they created TNA in 2002. And the X Division, out of guys, they create X Division for smaller guys, focused on high energy, high impact action. And then they decide to highlight an ex WWE guy, no, an ex WCW guy in AJ Styles as one of their main eventers. That lighter guys started to get really noticed. Now, also in 2002, Ring of Honor was founded. It was originally a direct-to-video service, and the three guys in its main event in the first show was Christopher Daniels, Bryan Danielson, and Loki. All three had at one point worked for WWE, and none of the three went anywhere because they're all deemed too small. But they were known as the Fathers of Honor, and all became huge names on the independent circuit by showing what smaller guys could do. Now, with the birth of these smaller federations, which never quite equaled out to competition for WWE, came smaller guys getting highlighted. As I said, there was AJ Styles in TNA. There was also Christopher Daniels in TNA. They feuded constantly. There was also the X Division in TNA, which was a highlight of TNA shows. There was CM Punk in Ring of Honor. There was Bryan Danielson in Ring of Honor, and Tyler Black, who would later go on to become Seth Rollins. All these guys would become huge stars, and all of them were smaller guys. Not necessarily shorter guys, but smaller builds, could do amazing things in the ring. Now, TNA would later go through some financial problems and would be bought and sold numerous times. Same way with Ring of Honor, but both would eventually get television deals and be highlighted on the national stage. The WWF, after Eddie Guerrero's death in 2005, in early 2006, would sign up their wellness program that they have now because of widespread rumors about wrestlers taking drugs and steroids. And the wellness program was twofold. It would check for drugs and steroids, and it would check just the general well-being of the wrestlers. For those of you still with me, I doubt any of you are. It at one point found a heart condition in MVP and helped him get it solved. Surprisingly, it never found Chris Benoit was on steroids. But what it did is it forced WWE to use smaller guys because the big guys could no longer take steroid. You've seen Randy Orton go from puffy to lean. You've seen the big guys who were already big couldn't get bigger. You've seen the big guys who came in big, they couldn't get bigger. They just stayed the same size they were. And you've seen the small guys who came in didn't really get that much bigger. So the small guys who they were now signing, which was the majority of outside talent, because there weren't that many drugs, because most of the companies had drug policies. They just stayed small in WWE, and they did amazing things. And now we've got these spot fest matches, which the people expect, and so you can't have these huge guys who have to take rest breaks every 5 seconds because people don't expect that anymore. They expect small, light guys who can fly. So that's pretty much the video. For those that stuck with me, that was about a 16-minute video. Um, I believe I covered everything. Um, Join me Wednesday for Terror Train 2.